My parents kick me out to mend their marriage after years of conflict. After 6 months, they want me to return home because they need my signature to obtain funds for my grandparents. My parents' marriage was an absolute disaster while I was growing up. They clashed often and were incompatible from the beginning. Imagine those tumultuous high school relationships when couples are often splitting up and then getting back together, but my parents were unable to leave the house since they were married. They were unable to get away from one another. And I was unable to do so from the day I was born. I was thrust into a world where physical altercations, yelling and screaming were commonplace. Their disputes would frequently begin with something insignificant, such as a tiny quarrel or miscommunication, but the tension would swiftly build into a full-fledged conflict. These altercations frequently turned violent, with them hurling things across the room or striking one another. I started to associate the loud TV sound in the background with the sound of glass breaking or a large item banging against the wall. I was too little to comprehend why. My parents were often so upset with one another. I only knew that I was afraid of their conflicts. My natural reaction to their ranting was to weep, since it was the only way I could communicate the terror and bewilderment their rage produced. But all I got in return for my pleas for solace or for them to stop was more rage. They would become angry with me and yell at me to stop sobbing and to be quiet. I thus soon discovered that it was unsafe for me to express my feelings, that even my despair and anxiety were unwanted in my own house. As a result, I no longer felt secure in my own parents' presence. My worst sense of vulnerability and fear came from the two persons who were meant to keep me safe and secure. They couldn't even protect themselves from harming one another, so I couldn't rely on them to protect me. I created coping strategies as I got older to protect myself from the mayhem. When the battle started, I would go to the closest safe spot I could locate, which was generally my bathroom or bedroom, or any other location where I could lock the door and prevent myself from being enraged. I would try to block out the sounds of their fighting in enclosed areas by putting my head under a pillow or occasionally covering my ears. Thankfully, when my maternal grandparents took over, things started to improve. I believe they eventually reached a breaking point after years of silently seeing the disastrous pattern of my parents' relationship. My parents made the decision to act after seeing the profound impact their ongoing arguments were having on me. My grandparents and other worried relatives planned an intervention, a time when everyone joined forces to face the issue head-on. My parents were offered a choice during this intervention. They could either split or get professional assistance through marriage therapy. For the first time, I had the impression that someone actually understood the harm their relationship was doing to both themselves and me. In addition to preserving their marriage, the intervention also protected me from the continuous emotional upheaval. My family made it apparent that things needed to happen since the poisonous atmosphere was really harming my mental health. First, then hesitantly, my parents consented to begin marriage therapy. Over time, we could tell that the procedure was having an impact, even if it was gradual and sometimes uncomfortable for them. My parents' violent, explosive arguments decreased in frequency, and when they occurred, they were more restrained and concentrated on talking to each other, rather than hurling insults. They seemed to be gradually picking up a new language, one of respect and understanding rather than rage and blame. Our home gradually grew calmer, free of the ongoing stress and anxiety that had long been the norm. But when their relationship started to become better, I saw something that made me feel a little wounded and perplexed. It seemed like my parents were separating from me. There had been some sort of engagement in my everyday life before, even in the middle of their insanity. Little things like my dad dropping me off at school and my mom making breakfast for me demonstrated that they were still looking after me in their own unique ways. However, these actions started to fade as they concentrated more on saving their marriage. My mother stopped getting up early and preparing my breakfast all of a sudden. My dad would claim he was too busy to drive me to school, but he no longer insisted on doing so. Rather, they would give me some cash and instruct me to purchase lunch if I needed it or ride the bus. It was an odd and unnerving encounter. Our house was no longer a battlefield, and I was glad that the violence had subsided. However, I also experienced a new form of loneliness. Although I recognized that they were going through a lot, I couldn't get rid of the sense that I was being abandoned, that they had somehow forgotten about me in their efforts to mend the rift between them. My parents' attention to their relationship grew with time, but it seemed to come at the price of their bond with me. They began to leave me alone and go out more frequently, just the two of them. I was left at home and instructed to eat any leftovers I could find in the refrigerator while they went out for meals or romantic nights, something they had never done before. Additionally, they ceased inquiring about my grades and demonstrating any concern for my academic progress. I recall the rare occasions when I would joyfully announce a grade I had earned through hard effort in the hopes of receiving a grin or a compliment. Rather, they would react indifferently, hardly recognizing my words before returning to their own discussion. I wanted to celebrate with my closest pals as my 15th birthday drew near. I had never been permitted to celebrate my birthday before that year, and I had always accepted it without actually protesting. But this time, I was determined to have a party and, for once, feel like a typical adolescent. In order to finally have a birthday celebration, I plucked up the confidence to ask my parents. My mom told me that I needed to quit looking for ways to waste more of their money, and my dad firmly rejected the concept. Her remarks were profound, giving me the impression that I was a burden and that I had no right to request anything. She went on to add that I should figure out how to pay them back for all the money they have spent on me over the years rather than requesting more goods. Normally, as so many times before, I would have moved on, swallowed my disappointment, and withdrawn inside myself. But something inside of me exploded. I felt depressed, irritated, and angry in a way I had never experienced before. Perhaps it was the culmination of years of feeling abandoned, or perhaps it was my adolescent hormones. But I was at my breaking point. They had never actually done anything for me, other than giving birth, and they had never made me feel loved or cared for. I screamed at them. I questioned them why they had me in the first place if they were so angry with me and explained that it was not my duty to return anything. My mother, who had never touched me before, gave me a hard smack across the face after hearing my outcry. Her words hurt much more than the startling sting of her touch on my cheek. I had no right to talk to them that way, she informed me, that I was fortunate that they had done as much for me as they did, and that I should be thankful for simply existing. Tears were starting to form. I looked to my father in the hopes that he would intervene, protect me, or at the very least console me. With a look of sadness on his face, he just shook his head. He said that as I was becoming older, it was time for me to mature and learn appropriate behavior. He accused me of being immature and said I shouldn't be arguing with them about something as minor as a birthday celebration. I was devastated by what they said. I realized then that my aspirations and sentiments were irrelevant in their eyes. I felt more alone than ever that night, so I sobbed myself to sleep. The atmosphere at home became even more strained in the days after my outburst. My mother never showed regret for smacking me, and she never acknowledged the damage or pain I had caused. That night seemed to have never occurred. These days it felt like my parents made a point of avoiding any kind of contact. Unless it was absolutely essential, they would not talk to me, and even then, their comments were chilly and abrupt. My dad called me into the living room a week later. I could sense a problem as soon as I went in. He was seated there with my mother, both of them looking serious and unpleasant. As I readied myself for yet another round of reprimands, my heart plummeted. As I sat down to think about what I had done this time, I could feel the tension rising within of me. I was afraid of what would happen next, so I couldn't even look them in the eyes. My dad began talking before I could respond. He spoke in a calm tone. However, there was a hint of danger that unnerved me. He added that he and my mother thought that their marriage was nearly perfect now, and that they had been thinking a lot since our previous talk. He explained to me that they had both put in a great deal of effort to get to the point where they were content together. He hesitated, though, and what he said next really shocked me. He went on to advise that in order for them to genuinely move ahead toward a happy marriage, they still needed to address one significant problem that was preventing them from being happy. Then, after giving me a direct look, my father declared that I was the reason they failed. I tried to understand what he was saying as I sat there motionless. It nearly didn't register at first since he said it so plainly and matter-of-factly. He went on to claim that they thought their marriage might be flawless if it weren't for the responsibility of parenting me. My mother interrupted me as I sat there with my heart racing, her voice piercing and tinged with resentment. She said that I was the reason they had nearly separated, and that having me around the house served as a continual reminder of how much they despised me. According to my dad, they didn't really have a choice because they had me while they were young. Neither of them had been able to acknowledge to the other that they had come to hate the job of parenthood over the years. He said that many of their arguments sprang from this hidden animosity. He continued by telling me that they both soon discovered they had similar feelings of disdain for me, their own child, after they began attending counseling. After that, they attempted to save their marriage by emotionally separating from one another, but it seems it wasn't enough. The last straw for them had been my recent disobedient actions. They had come to see how much of a burden I was on their life. They desired to go on and live their lives without being reminded of what they now considered to be their relationship's greatest regret. The weight of their remarks froze me as I sat there, making me feel as though time had stopped and everything around me had become meaningless. Everything I believed I understood about love, family, and my family was completely destroyed by the people who had reared me and had always been the center of my universe. An inclusion. My mother continued by saying that they wanted me to soon go in with my grandparents, as if that wasn't enough. I would have to figure something out on my own if my grandparents didn't want to take me in, just in case, she said. Almost casually. She seemed unconcerned with whether that meant living with a buddy or on my own. She and my father were obviously done with me based on the way she spoke, which was so cold and uncaring. They had already erased me from their lives as if I had never been there, moving on in their imaginations. I stared at them, hoping to see any sorrow, any indication that they may reconsider. All I saw, however, were icy, determined faces. Their eyes lacked sympathy and love, and they didn't even vaguely resemble the parents I had so desperately wanted for so long. The knowledge that the people who brought me into the world, who were meant to love and care for me, had determined that I was disposable broke my heart. After this entire exchange, I sat in my room that evening, stunned. The fact that they had asked me to leave the house while I was still a minor still astounded me. Since they were finished, they expected me to fend for myself and discover my own path. Done with the failure they said had destroyed their marriage. Done with me and done with the obligations of fatherhood. I was unable to think or breathe. I was unable to comprehend that my own parents were ignoring me as though I were nothing, and I was overcome with grief and incredulity. My grandparents rushed to my aid right away when my mother told her parents that they had decided to expel me. I could see the rage in my grandmother's eyes as soon as they got there. She was so furious at what my parents were doing to me that she was nearly trembling. When she approached my mother and demanded to know how she could have done something so callous, her normally soft voice became piercing and furious. My dad attempted to defend their behavior by saying that my grandparents' insistence was the only reason they kept me and that they never wanted me in the first place. He informed them that since they were so concerned about me, it was now their duty to house me. The way he described me sliced through me like a knife, as if I were only a duty they had been made to fulfill. However, my grandparents refused to give up. Calm but forceful, my grandfather turned to me and instructed me to collect all of my critical paperwork and pack my clothing. Tears were flowing down my cheeks as I staggered back to my room in a haze. I was weeping uncontrollably as I hurriedly packed my things into a suitcase while my hands were shaking. I was being tormented by the idea of leaving the only house I had ever known. I was aware of how fortunate I was to have my grandparents there to adopt me. It didn't make my own parents' rejection any less painful. I hoped that my parents would reconsider, that they would wake up and understand what they were doing, while I packed each thing. I fervently hoped they would stop me, admit their error, and tell me they loved me and wanted me to remain. However, no such words appeared. My grandparents were there to help me carry my belongings when I eventually left. I looked back at my parents, expecting to see a look of reluctance or remorse, but they didn't even raise their eyes. Ignoring me, they sat at the kitchen table and held hands. What was remained of my heart was crushed as I saw them sitting there together, unified in their choice. My parents' decision to prioritize their relationship over their own kid came to light at that same time, and I came to understand that they only cared about each other. Some of the worst days of my life were in the initial weeks when I moved into my grandparents' home. My parents' horrifying visions plagued me every night, causing me to wake up in the middle of the night, soaked in perspiration, tears flowing down my cheeks. I couldn't get rid of the immense grief that came with having my own parents forsake me, so I would lie there shivering in the dark. In addition, I began becoming sick a lot, which was a physical reflection of the anguish I was experiencing. My grandfather took me to the doctor because he was concerned about my health. Following several tests, the physician explained tactfully that my mental health was suffering greatly as a result of the stress I was experiencing. I was gradually being broken down by the physical manifestations of the weight of my emotions. I sensed that I was sinking deeper into an abyss of hopelessness. I lost interest in everything that used to be important to me, stopped taking care of myself, and began eating erratically. My academic performance started to deteriorate. It was painful how much I missed my parents. I continued wondering and expecting that they would give me a call, acknowledge their error, and bring me back. However, the phone did not ring. In desperate situations, I would attempt to phone them myself, holding on to the notion that my voice would serve as a reminder that I was still alive and their kid. However, they consistently failed to answer my calls. I would contact my mom, telling her everything, pleading with her to come get me. Her quiet served as a harsh reminder of how little I now mattered to her. Yet all she would do was leave me on read. Week after week passed, each one more burdensome than the previous. As I struggled to accept the fact that my parents had really abandoned me, I was living in agony and my heart was hurting a bit more every day. My grandma then broke down in tears one day as she was combing my hair in an attempt to console me and restore some normalcy to my life. She sobbed aloud while holding the brush in shaky hands. She sobbed as she expressed her desire for me to not have to endure this and her and my grandfather's want to see me happy once more. I had a jolt of knowledge and a twinge of shame as I saw my grandma cry. This person who loved me very much was in as much anguish as I was, if not more, because she was unable to ease my suffering. I realized then that I couldn't continue to allow myself to collapse. My parents had already made up their minds and gone on, so they had no intention of returning. I knew I had to come to terms with that fact, even if it was painful to do so. At that moment, I understood that I had to begin reassembling my life, not just for my grandparents but also for me. They were doing everything they could to help me recover, and they had taken me in when I had nowhere else to go. They deserved to watch me make an effort and battle to start over. I made the decision to go one day at a time after that. There were still days when the grief seemed unbearable, so it wasn't always easy. I felt as though I was out of breath when I missed my parents so much. For my own sake and the sake of those who still cared about me, however, I realized I had to keep going. I owed it to my grandparents and to myself to try to find a way back to happiness since they had become my lifeline. I gradually started to turn my attention from the debilitating grief of losing my parents to the little, encouraging things that were beginning to occur in my life over the course of the months. For instance, every morning my grandma prepares my breakfast. She spreads ketchup in the shape of a smiling face on my bread, which is a cute habit. Even though it is such a small gesture, it gives me a sense of caring that I have never experienced before. Because my grandpa is a stickler for neatness and thinks that a rumpled shirt is a bad representation of a person's character, he meticulously irons my school clothing every morning, making me seem put together and professional when I leave for class. I've also never had the liberties that come with living with my grandparents. I am permitted to take part in extracurricular activities. My parents had never allowed me to do this, but now I've made new acquaintances and joined groups and sports teams. Weekends are now something I also look forward to. I had never been able to spend much time with my friends previously, but my grandparents constantly pushed me to do so. I can now go out, enjoy myself, and be a teenager without worrying about being evaluated all the time. I've noticed that I've been thinking about my parents less and less with time. Of course, the ache is still there, however, I'm not as consumed with it as I once was. My grandparents have been excellent in establishing a setting where I feel loved, respected, and safe. Their house has gradually turned into my home. I've been away from my parents' house for 6 months now. I still get frequent visits from other family members on both my father's and mother's sides. As soon as word got out about what my parents had done, everyone in the family was shocked and furious. Everyone has stopped communicating with my parents one by one after questioning them about their choice to leave me. I do occasionally get tidbits of information about my parents' lives from some of my relatives. My absence seems to have strengthened their bond. Enjoying the increased tranquility in their marriage, they even recently took a vacation. It hurt to hear that, but I made an effort to ignore my thoughts. I was determined to move on and concentrate on the life I was re-establishing with my grandparents, so I hadn't been in touch with them in months. Then, yesterday, something unexpected occurred. My heart stopped when I looked at the screen of my ringing phone. My mother had called me. I briefly believed I was having a nasty mental trick, but despite my repeated attempts to massage my eyes, the phone continued to ring. With my heart racing in my chest, I snatched it up with a trembling hand. The sound of her breathing on the other end was the first thing I heard when I finally responded. It was unsteady and unsure. She finally spoke after an uneasy pause that seemed to last forever. I had forgotten how gentle her voice sounded. She inquired about how I was doing, almost hesitantly. I was unable to answer the question, which lingered in the air. How was I going to respond to her? That I was all right? That I was damaged? That despite my daily need for them, I harbored resentment at them for their actions? Uncertain of what to say, I remained silent. She then resumed the conversation, asking if I could talk as she needed to talk to me about something crucial. Her cautious, nearly prepared remarks left me wondering what could possibly be so significant now, after all this time. Why now? When they had apparently gone on with their lives and had been silent for months. A lot of hurt had festered in the months since they ejected me, and a lot of things remained unspoken between us. I had a nagging, agonizing hope that perhaps, just possibly, she was trying to make apologies, but I wasn't sure whether I was prepared to hear what she had to say. Despite the flurry of emotions rushing through me, I tried to remain calm as I asked her what she wanted. On the other end. There was a silence, and I could just hear her getting up the nerve to talk. After taking a big breath, my mother asked if I could return home. Instead of relief, I felt a weird, hollow sensation as the words that I had yearned to hear for so many agonizing months finally came out. She went on to add that she and her father had given it some thought and regretted throwing me out. They urged me to return home and make apologies. I wasn't comfortable with what she said, though. She never once expressed genuine regret for all that she and my father had done to me. She read from a script, as if she had practiced her words. I could detect no genuine feeling of regret or sadness behind them. I told her that it seemed like she was lying and that I didn't trust her.